get started. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely Wednesday morning. And thank you for joining us for a really special webinar, the last webinar of the year from SolveME. Today, we're looking at the future of IACCI and long COVID research, MECFS, and the unfinished work of the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force. That's a mouthful, also known as the COPVS Task Force. I am so pleased to be joined here by Dr. Leonard Jason, a professor of psychology at DePaul University. And we are going to get started with a really great presentation about some of this work with a really cool announcement at the end as well. So for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Leonard Jason, he is a professor of psychology at DePaul University and the director of the Center for Community Research. He has served on so many different functions and so many publications and has done so much for this community. You can read his background there, but I would especially like to acknowledge that Dr. Jason recently celebrated 50 years in this amazing field with all of this amazing work, and we are so grateful for his involvement, specifically as a member of the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force as part of the Recover initiative. This task force no longer exists currently, but we are going to take a look back at what this task force did, what its accomplishments were, what some of the challenges it faced, and then where we go from here. Again, it's a privilege to work with Dr. Jason, who has been absolutely a pillar of the scientific and research community in this space. We wouldn't be here at this level of understanding without him. Let me just go to the next slide really quickly. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Well, I jumped ahead. Sorry. My apologies. We can go ahead and drop the slides there. Fantastic. There we go. I can see you now, Dr. Jason. Hello. The last thing I want to add in terms of how this webinar is going to be structured is we're going to have Dr. Jason make a quick presentation on some of the topics I just shared. Then we're going to have a quick conversation about what it was like to serve on this task force. I was a member of the task force as well in my role here at SolveME. And then after that, we're going to have a quick announcement, and then we'll go into your Q&A. So with that, I believe that's everything in terms of our preamble. So, oh my goodness, I forgot one important thing. My apologies. I forgot to introduce myself. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my apologies. It is a privilege to have you here. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm the president and CEO of SolveME. SolveME has been serving the MECFS community since 1987, and I have joined the organization many years, probably familiar with many of you through our advocacy work, and have recently stepped into the role as CEO. So apologies for that oversight. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Leonard Jason. Thank you so much. Please share with us all of this great work that this Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force for the Recover Initiative undertook.
Thank you so much, Emily. As you mentioned, from 2022 to 2023, this particular task force was established in the United States. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what occurred and a little bit about what was accomplished and things that still need to be worked on. Some of you probably know about Recover. This was dealing with, we'll call it long COVID, but they referred to it as PASS. $1.15 billion was allocated to focus on 30 hubs around the United States. 15 involved adult cohorts. There were 2 pregnancy cohorts. There were 8 pediatric cohorts and 5 autopsy centers. And this is what's usually referred to as the NIH Recover Initiative. And this was an initiative to improve our understanding of recovery after SARS-CoV-2 infection and to prevent and treat long COVID. So that was the overall mission. As part of this larger mission, there were 10 pathobiological multidisciplinary task force committees that were established. One of these that we're most interested in with our group is commonalities with other post-viral syndromes. And as Emily said, Emily was on this group, I was on this group too, and I was recommended to the group by the Illinois Hub, so I appreciate that. And the scope was the overlap of long COVID symptoms and possible pathways with other post-viral syndromes, including overlap of COVID with MECFS and other dysautonomias. And again, this was something that began a little bit before this particular task force was started in this prior summer. And then basically in February of 2022, this commonality was put together. And the data collection had actually begun with questionnaires that were actually developed in 2021, the summer and fall. So what we were doing in the sense, we're looking back over some of the material that had been developed as data started being collected across all these hubs. And as you can see from this group, there are some very prominent MECFS researchers, and also, as you can see, patient advocates that were associated with this particular task force. About a month after we began meeting, we decided to create a subcommittee to answer some very specific questions that were coming up from some of the other committees and task forces. So this particular committee was called the Diagnostic Testing and Test Algorithm Subcommittee. These were the members of it. And as you can see, I was asked to be chairperson of this particular group. And we as a subcommittee actually did some work that I'm going to probably spend most of my time focusing on, since we have somewhat limited time during this presentation. So over this 1.5-year period, we basically looked very closely at the battery, the adult battery that thousands of people were at that point filling out over time. And we sort of said, okay, if you're going to be looking at SARS-CoV-2 and potentially long COVID, are you able to, with the data that's being collected, be able to understand whether some of those individuals might get classified with MECFS? In our committee, in our particular subcommittee, we basically said that some of the key symptoms of MECFS were not actually being asked, so that we felt that it was very likely that it would be difficult to assess MECFS without those particular questions. So we recommended that they should really use a validated questionnaire to assess critical MECFS symptoms. And our decision was to use something our group at Depal had developed, the Depal Symptom Questionnaire. One of the reasons is it's brief. And the questionnaire from Recover had so many questions that they wanted something relatively brief. So there were really only 14 questions. But with these 14 questions, you have some major issues being covered, like post-exertional malaise, unrefreshing sleep, cognitive impairment, so that you could really be able to determine whether a person might have MECFS. When we looked at all these questionnaires, what we found of 14 critical symptoms, only 7 of them were currently being assessed in the battery that was collecting data. So we made a recommendation that that should change. So as an example, cold limbs, which is really classic for people with MECFS, feeling hot or cold for no reasons, flu-like symptoms. Some smells, foods, medications, or chemicals make you feel sick. Those types of questions were not on the questionnaire. And yet, as we know, MECFS often does have flu-like symptoms, cold limbs, and these other issues. So based on our recommendations and working on this for over a year period of time, in March of 2023, after making presentations at multiple task force meetings and multiple committees, Recover added 24 triggering questions to capture frequency and severity of MECFS symptoms. And those symptoms and questions had not previously been on the questionnaire. So we provided input to changing measures of occurrence. Sometimes there was just measures, does this thing occur, to something much more precise, which involves, it's not just the occurrence of something, it's really how severe is it. And we were able to get that into the changes. In addition, we then began looking at the pediatric cohort and the battery, and we were surprised to find that neither youth or guardians would ever asked whether they had MECFS. Now, certainly it's not enough to ask that. You need to ask questions too, but that's a basic question. They did ask questions on lots of other illnesses, but not MECFS. In addition, post-exertional malaise, main symptoms of MECFS, were not adequately being assessed. So we again introduced questions from the Depal Symptom Questionnaire to the pediatric battery. And again, after multiple meetings and recommendations, they adopted changes to the pediatric main cohort. So again, these are two classic examples of us being able to make some difference with this recovery initiative. We also wrote a grant, which was approved by our subcommittee and committee to collect MECFS data, which would be a couple hundred patients with MECFS, and the Ancillary Studies Oversight Committee actually approved the grant. Unfortunately, we didn't have funds to actually do this part. So that's a limitation. It would still be something good to have a cohort of people who had MECFS prior to 2020, before pandemic occurred. But this study was not done. Now, one of the things our subcommittee also worked on, these are some of the authors of it, was a white paper, and we published it in Brain Behavior and Immunity 2023. And I just wanted to kind of cover some of the issues that we talked about in this particular paper that is available. If anybody would like a copy of it, just email me and I'm happy to send it to you. First thing we talked about, that there's actually shared mechanisms of MECFS and long COVID. There's a number of data points that suggest that in multiple areas. I'll give just two, cardiac and brain functioning, for a second. Let's look at cardiac similarities between MECFS and long COVID. David Systrom has found preload failure is found in actually both groups. And what this means is there's an inability to provide enough blood to the heart for it to fill properly. And that reduces cardiac output and the amount of blood provided to the muscles during exercise. There's also similarities in CNS, central nervous system. So for example, EEG results of people who've been hospitalized with SARS-CoV-2 show frontal lobe findings, diffuse slowing and generalized delta activity. And that's actually characteristic of neuroinflammatory condition. And in patients with MECFS, we've also found some reduced delta band connectivity in the left posterior cingulate 24 hours after hand grip challenge. You can hear the sirens going outside. This is because this is Chicago and right next to a street at my office at DePaul University. And anyway, this is a considerable theoretical interest. This type finding is that the posterior cingulate is one of the most metabolically active and highly connected hub regions in the brain. There's also other data about physiological similarities. And again, it's been a number of publications about long COVID and MECFS from people like Tony Komaroff and Cindy Bateman. And Tate and others believe that both MECFS and long COVID arise by similar mechanisms involving neuroinflammation. So one of the questions that we also covered is single versus multiple triggers. Well, of course, those with long COVID have been exposed to a SARS-CoV-2 virus, whether those with MECFS have multiple triggers. In other words, there is some substantive differences in precipitating events, those with long COVID versus a variety of triggering events in MECFS. So if those with a single trigger, long COVID, and those with multiple triggers have some comparable consequences, this would represent a rather important finding for NIH and scientists, and the public would want to know about this. There certainly are some differences in symptoms, such as hair loss that occurs with long COVID. But if the majority of symptoms and biological abnormalities are comparable, then it's less likely that one trigger is causing all the debilitating long-term symptoms of long COVID. It's very likely that it's the organism's response to the triggering event that causes some of the dysfunction in multiple areas. Now, we'll also kind of look at length of illness. Those who have been sick with long COVID have been sick for sometimes a few months or a few years from 2020 on. Well, the MECFS samples have been sick often for much longer periods of time. Well, there's implications for this too. It's possible that to begin making predictions of what might occur over time for those with long COVID. These data are available from MECFS samples. And such information could provide critical answers to questions now being discussed by scientists and government officials in the US and elsewhere. Just quickly about the Epstein-Barr findings. The most common clinical syndrome following Epstein-Barr virus infection is infectious mononucleosis. And 60% of patients with MECFS report an infectious illness sometime before onset of MECFS. And the most frequently reported infectious illness is mononucleosis. Well, it's very heartening to see that the Recover Core Operations Committee has approved one of the task force recommendations to test a certain number of adult participants with various COVID statuses for EBC using 4 antibody tests. And Recover is now also examining those with initial SARS infection, how this interacts with the occurrence of EBV. According to a number of long COVID investigators, like the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection might actually reactivate latent viruses like EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, and those with long COVID. And just one finding, Sue and other, that long COVID anticipating risk factor at the time of initial COVID-19 diagnosis is EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. So Epstein-Barr virus is not the cause of long COVID, but it could reactivate, yielding some positive serologies. So one of the questions that we could ask is, why is so much research being funded with long COVID and not that much with the MECFS? And some of the things that you'll hear at conferences and with among scientists is that COVID has a clear specific trigger and ME does not. Well, it's true that SARS-CoV-2 has continually evolved, resulting in the emergence of several lineages and variants. Samples often include, for example, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. These have different transmission severity and immune evasion properties. They're not all the same. Well, the majority of patients with ME report infectious illnesses before the onset of ME. In fact, 30% of cases of ME are due to infectious mononucleosis caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. So it is possible to study ME due to Epstein-Barr virus, which has even more specific type of onset than SARS-CoV-2, given all of its variants. So trying to sum up what we've been discussing so that we can have some chance for some dialogue with the audience. Considerable work needs to be done in the long COVID area. This is what we said in our white paper: specifying symptoms, developing sound psychometric instruments to measure the symptoms, establishing thresholds that symptoms need to meet to signal it is a burden. And insights from MECFS research could help in the development of research with long COVID. Ultimately, it could improve our efforts to understand its pathophysiology, early diagnosis and prognosis, as well as identify effective treatments. Now, there's been some recent developments that I wanted to mention, and that is Congress has asked NIH to focus on what's called Recover TLC. The initial Recover grant was for 4 years, and that'll be ending this year. So basically, this Recover TLC is really focusing more on treatment. And there was a webinar on November 21st, 2024, which was a great overview, where they talked about they're going to be establishing working groups to review ideas for treatments for long COVID. And the focus will be the best possible treatments. So these trials could ultimately be taken up by pharmacies with FDA approval and spread to large numbers of people. So there are working groups on issues that are going to focus on pulmonary and neurologic issues. And we hope, or at least I hope, and Emily does, that the Commonalities working group could be established as one of the working groups. If you're interested in serving on a working group to begin reviewing treatments, the Recover TLC has this link that's below. It's very easy to find if you just put it into Google search, but this is the one. So if you want to volunteer to be part of a working group, they're very interested in finding out who's interested. That's something that you can do. So I'm going to, at this point, turn things over back to my colleague, Emily Taylor, and I just want to, again, thank her and SolveME for asking me to represent some of the work that I think we accomplished on this important task force. And certainly, as you probably recognize, these are my views, and they're not the views of Recover or US government. I'm happy to talk with Emily now about kind of turn things back to her. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Dr. Jason. It was so great to hear that summary of the work we've done together and how that fits into the broader work of Recover and the recommendations that were made. And so a couple of questions from the audience before we move on. One of the interesting points you brought up was the recommendation for an MECFS cohort. And we moved that process forward up until it hit the budget committee where it kind of dropped. Where does that go from there? What is the next step? Is there any opportunity to potentially provide funding there?
Well, that's a good question. So it's tricky because Recover really was focusing on funding kind of long COVID for people who had SARS-CoV-2. And there are basically efforts to look at people who potentially develop MECFS, and certainly with these new questions, that's going to be possible. Suzanne Vernon has a paper that has just been accepted and will be published soon that will be talking about some estimates of MECFS, but having a group that's really identified much more systematically, that has MECFS before SARS-CoV-2 became available, I think would be very important. I'm not sure how to get this thing funded, but certainly MECFS research specifically is not under the mandate of Recover. So they didn't think that that was something that they would be able to fund, but they approved of it and they thought it would be a useful thing to do, and our task force did. We were then just kind of stuck in a sense of not sure what to do next. But it's still alive. It's still something that could happen. It just we haven't taken the next steps on it, are a little bit complicated as to where we get the funds.
That's always the critical question, right? How can we do that? And we'll talk about that in a second. But to another question that came from the audience that I think is really interesting and is worth highlighting is that folks are asking about the 2024 MECFS research roadmap that the NIH also funded, and the NIH is also responsible for the Recover initiative. And so is there any connection between those two? Is there a plan for those to work together? What is the plan to get either of these items to kind of collaborate, or is there a plan to get either of these items to collaborate?
Well, there was a excellent kind of program in the fall that really kind of talked about potential treatments that could occur for long COVID, and that was popularized on the web, and people were able to view it. It was several days. and they brought in some really very distinguished people to NIH to talk about that. And then prior to that, there has been really an examination of all the different areas where potentially MECFS research could be taken to the next step. So, clearly there's a tremendous interest in treatment. I do think at this point that we're going to probably need to see what the funding mechanisms are going forward. As you all know, we have a new administration, and we'll have to see, what their position is, just generally NIH funding. So I do think that groups like SolveME and people who are in the audience that are concerned about funding, if they basically are able to, let their legislators know that this type of work is important. I know there's people within NIH who are, working very hard to try to find ways of getting treatments. And matter of fact, this last week, I've been, trying to put together a grant proposal on treatments myself. So it's not that there's not interest in it. I think there is. I think we're going to have to just sort of find kind of where the resources. Now, there's $500 million that's being placed into this initiative, this new recovery initiative. That's a lot of money. So we'll see how things trickle out from that. This is a NIAID initiative at this point. And they're working right now on trying to make some decisions about all these issues. So, but I'm kind of hoping that we get some great clinical trials and that we can maybe have, some individuals certainly with MECFS in them.
Absolutely. And so to the folks who would say, okay, the committee had done its work, it's made its recommendations, we've moved on, we've now have Recover TLC. What would your response be to folks who say, the recommendations have been made, why do we need to reassess or go back to these recommendations?
So I'll just kind of focus on two very specific issues. One is, how do we measure change over time? What are the outcome measures that are necessary for both long COVID and for MECFS? If you're going to have trials of people that have been, sick for a long time, a number of them are going to have MECFS. So you want to have appropriate measures, for example, of post-exertional malaise, cognitive impairment, of unrefreshing sleep. So if we had a working group that just really focused on things like, well, what are the measurement issues, so that when trials begin to be developed, there's a group that could potentially comment on them and say, as we did with Recover, say, well, if you put a whole battery together of hundreds of questions and you're not asking basic questions that can assess MECFS, you might be missing something. That's what this committee could potentially do. The other thing this committee could do is also look at the recommended treatments. Are there some treatments that basically are higher priorities that people might be, benefit from long COVID, but also MECFS? We could basically not only think about the type of treatment, but also what the kind of implications of those treatments might be, in terms of dosages, in terms of their positive and potentially second order effects. That's one of the main things that we need to always be doing, is saying, well, you can help somebody, but is there harm occurring too? And that's something that we have a particular sensitivity towards, particularly what has occurred in the last 20 years in the MECFS field.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. So the last question, I want to zoom out a little bit. We've been really talking about the implications of this particular task force and MECFS specifically, and how that's been so valuable. But could we talk about zooming out? And if we were to, say, reinstate this task force, would there be other groups, like, for example, dysautonomia and POTS, or mast cell activation syndrome? Would there be other value to adding other IACCIs in the conversation? And could we streamline research across the space?
Yeah, if you look at the members of the Commonalities Task Force, there were people with expertise in all those areas. So certainly you want to have kind of a broad group that has expertise across these different important topics. And again, the more people you have that could basically do those types of kind of analyses that have expertise in things like MAST and others, that's fantastic, because then you really bring something new to the large research endeavor, particularly kind of focus on really 30 years of research in some very basic areas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Jason. So with that, I'd like to move on to a quick announcement. Fantastic here. So this is an action that SolveME is so pleased to announce today. We are announcing the action kit is now live for folks to get involved and tell the Recover Initiative to reinstate the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force. We have a petition going to Recover Leadership. You can see that QR code on your screen right now, or the link will be available either on your screen, or we can drop that in the chat as well. This action is calling upon the Recover Task Force, or the Recover Initiative, as they launch into TLC, as they launch into a new world of treatments. They desperately need the voice of this task force, the expertise of people with MECFS, with POTS, with other forms of dysautonomia, with MCAS, to get involved. And just as Dr. Jason described, on the metrics, on the implementation, on the protocols, all of this is so important to have these other experts weigh in. So this is our chance to make a difference, not just for those with MECFS and long COVID, but bringing in other infection-associated chronic illnesses as part of this research, so that we can learn from what's already known rather than starting all the way at square one. Together, we can advocate for comprehensive research, meaningful solutions, and really reflects the complexity and challenges of these multitudes of conditions that all overlap. And we really think that this task force can be such a great, and has already proven to be such a great mechanism that has brought so much information and so much positive results in the Recover Initiative, that we obviously would like to continue that great history and tradition of success, but moving forward with the Recover TLC. So again, we are so excited to have you get involved in this campaign. You can take action either by clicking that QR code. We'll share the link in the chat, or you can it's available on the Solve social channels, and it'll be available on the SolveME website. So thank you for sharing your voice, for helping raise the importance of the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force within Recover, and to get that mechanism reinstated to be the bridge between all of this existing knowledge into the Recover Initiative, so that we're not duplicating or repeating work that's already been done. So with that, we'll go into our second Q&A segment. I'm sure folks have lots of questions now, but I'm going to circle back on a couple of really detailed ones that were really interesting. And this is actually a little bit on the work of the previous task force. So one folk asked specifically, we talked about the link with Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, but what about other viral reactivations like HHV6? Was the committee involved in making any recommendations around these areas, or was there any information provided through the committee about other viral reactivations like HHV6?
So there are investigators in this very large Recover Initiative that are looking at many, many different potentially triggers. Certainly HHV6 is one of those. And there are literally dozens, hundreds of investigators and researchers. And clearly that's a very important one that needs to be looked at and needs to basically be assessed. Now, the good thing is with Recover is that they have biological samples that are being stored, so that investigators, if they come up with ideas, can basically get permission to access those samples and look at a variety of different kind of potential viruses or other kind of insults that have occurred. So there's a wealth of data that's available And there will be hopefully funding available for people to, you know, be able to write grants. And that's, again, where it's so important to have, you know, Congress see the importance of this. And that's why SolveME and other patient organizations and the patient activists are able to, you know, continue to urge Congress to make, you know, post-viral illnesses really a critical entity that deserves to be studied, just like so many other important areas.
Wow, that's so meaningful, and that's actually a little cheat into the next question that was being asked is with the commonalities of with other post-viral syndromes task force, was there a mechanism through which the task force could influence the inclusion of patients that were non-COVID triggers, so pre-MECFS or other areas? Is that something that the task force looked into? I know the answer because I was on the task force, but I'd love to hear you explain a little about how that conversation took place and where it could potentially go if the task force was reinstated.
Yeah, I mean, my interest in a number of the people on the kind of subcommittee, we really wanted to get a group of individuals pre-2020 that had, you know, been sick with MECFS. We thought that that would be a fantastic comparison group. Even if we could get 100 or 200 people to go through the same testing battery. And as I said, we spent about a year just going from committee to committee to try to get the approvals. And then we finally did get the approvals, but then we weren't sure of what to do next. But that is, I think that would be tremendous addition to recover, to have something like that. But right now, we don't have kind of a group prior to 2020 that has been sick. And again, there could be a variety of different groups that could be looked at, not just those with MECFS, but, you know, we just picked MECFS because that's one that's probably pretty well known. It would be a tremendous comparison.
Absolutely. The questions are coming hot and heavy. I'm probably not going to get to everybody with the time we have left, but I'm going to keep getting into as many as we can. A really interesting question came up from a couple different folks about the genetic factors in potentially MECFS or potentially in long COVID. And were there any conversations in the commonalities with other post-viral syndromes task force about genetic factors? And was that information conveyed? And could that be an area that needs further exploration if the committee were reinstated, or the task force reinstated, pardon me?
At different times that issue was talked about in terms of absolutely genetics is very critical. And again, having large samples is so important for kind of genetics research because it's probably not going to be one gene. It's going to be a variety of multiple genes in interaction with the environment. So having thousands and thousands of blood samples collected from around the United States and having them available, I mean, what an incredible opportunity this is to kind of just go into the genetics. And that's why if they are going to do genetic research, you want to be so careful of who your patients are that you're basically looking at the genetics with. You know, certainly the SARS-CoV-2, they have whether they've been infected or not and what they've been infected with. But we also want to be so clear that we can classify those patients as to whether they've been characterized by other illnesses like MECFS. And that's why it's absolutely so important for us to get those data collected as well, so that they can match them with genetics. So that's really the future. And I see that as being a tremendous area that could, I think, really revolutionize our area with the data set that's been collected.
Here. And speaking of all the potential in that data, and how precious it could be, we have a really interesting question from an AI expert, who is asking if the commonalities with other post-viral syndromes task force would be interested in maybe using AI, or did we make any recommendations involving AI, or would that task force potentially be a mechanism for incorporating AI in Recover?
Yeah, we certainly had some discussions about AI, and as you know, over the last year, it's certainly gotten the media attention. And certainly, as we know, using random forests and lasso and these other data management strategies, we are able to, for example, be able to distinguish individuals with MECFS versus those who have kind of long COVID. So there are some differences. Some people certainly have both. But it's true that people with MECFS generally have more flu-like symptoms and have more kind of issues of, for example, feeling hot and cold on the limbs. And that's much less likely. The loss of smell and taste is much more common, for example, in some of the long COVID samples. So yes, there are kind of distinctions. Sometimes there's a thing called lasso and random forest. These are just two strategies. And I myself had been working with Jacob First, who's in the computer science department at DePaul, and we've been kind of using those methods for probably the last decade. And they're incredibly important because what happens is the computers can just print out hundreds and hundreds of different variations and learn from these variations and come up with the best ways of identifying differences. So, this is important. And, we need to, not only use this for diagnostic purposes, but also ultimately for treatment purposes too. Because each individual is so complicated that to have the best of artificial intelligence to be able to help us identify which systems in the body have not either broken down or aren't working well or aren't communicating with each other well, will ultimately require some of these artificial intelligence systems.
And what potential that could lead to, right? The thinking about what that data and paired with an AI could unlock. I shiver with excitement to think about how many amazing findings we could uncover. So I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to bring it to the last 2 to 3 questions. This question really caught my attention. I think this was a really good one, and I want to answer it personally, but I'm going to send it to you first, Dr. Jason. So in your Recover experience, what was the Recover leadership's understanding and general knowledge level of the symptom post-exertional malaise, in your opinion? And what was it before the task force, and what was it after the task force?
Well, that's actually a nice experiment to sort of basically have measurement kind of before and after, and to actually see how discussions of kind of these types of post-viral illnesses can lead to changes in people's perception of this construct. It's very complicated. And to just give you a quick example, some people have a very immediate reaction to exercise and or cognitive kind of challenges. Some people have delayed response. Some people have response that occurs for a short period of time, sometimes 24 hours to a week. Some people have response that goes for months. These are complicated systems that are going to require us to really begin to look at a phenomena that has really just only recently begun to be studied. It is a core symptom of this illness. Some individuals still kind of wonder whether that's the case, but I think the vast majority of scientists now believe it is. And I'm going to turn things over to you since I know, Emily, you want to say something on this matter?
Oh, thank you. It was one of the, I would add this if into your slides as one of our successes as the committee, as the task force. That I feel that the approach, especially the methodical approach to measuring post-exertional malaise, was really heard from our committee, and the recommendations we made, especially about your great work with the Depal questionnaire and using those tools, I think really elevated the understanding of the folks regarding post-exertional malaise. I would not call them experts. I think they have an empathy and an understanding for how complicated and complex that symptom is. And I think that that appreciation rolled over into the improvements, which I hope we will see continue in the Recover TLC. And I think that this task force would be perfectly suited to continue that work with Recover TLC to make sure that symptoms like post-exertional malaise, like cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, are really being explored using the knowledge base we've already hard earned from 40 years in the MECFS field. And so again, trying to stand on the shoulders of greatness rather than start back at the beginning at the ground. So I think that's something this task force could really be critical in doing, and was successful in doing it, but needs to be even more successful in continuing to do it, which is why this action to reinstate the task force, I think, is so critical, because it could be such an excellent mechanism of communicating that understanding and that improved respect for these symptoms and measuring them. So that just thank you for giving me my 2 cents on that one. That was I was very passionate about that. Last but not least, this is a question that I've wanted to ask you, Dr. Jason, and I'm so pleased that someone also brought it up in the chat. So thank you for that. What are you most proud about from your tenure with the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force and your role in Recover? What stands out as kind of your proudest moment?
Well, I think when, after maybe the 10th presentation of the importance of kind of measuring symptoms carefully beyond just the occurrence of them, because a lot of the Recover questionnaires did say, well, does this thing occur? But what I think we argued was that if you have, for example, a migraine headache once a month, that might be really severe at the time, but basically, is it really a burden for the person? So it's basically, we need to sort of ask questions in a way that can understand the symptoms' significance. Do they go beyond a threshold? And being able to have those discussions with eminent scientists and be able to kind of use the data that we have learned from over decades of research with MECFS was very gratifying to see that people were open to hearing those perspectives.
I would echo that with strong emphasis on the publication of the paper, What Can Long COVID Researchers Learn from 40 Years of MECFS Research? That was a moment that I really look back on with a huge amount of pride. And I'm very humbled, because that was one of my early experiences working on a publication of that nature, and being able to contribute and being able to read how and be part of that process and advise. I was incredibly proud of that moment. So I'll just add that to echo how powerful that was. And again, that link has been shared in the chat. If you haven't seen that paper, definitely recommend taking a look. It's a very exciting piece that I think can still be elevated, and I think more like it should be coming down the pike if the Commonalities with Other Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force is reinstated, because there's so much more work like that could still be done. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up for today. We're almost out of time. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for your service on this task force, for your continued work in the community, your amazing years of service, and your amazing dedication to truly reshape the landscape of how we look at this disease in the research space. I cannot emphasize that so much again, and to just be so grateful for your work. And I hope, if this action is successful, we get to work together on another Commonalities with Post-Viral Syndromes Task Force soon. Thank you so much. With that, I have a couple last minute announcements to make. Thank you so much, Afifa. Just a reminder for those of you who are struggling with or know someone, a loved one who is dealing with severe ME, we have a special webinar series that's been going on since October, bringing resources specific to the severe ME community. That'll be coming up again in January for those of you who have not yet been part of it. So please, those are available on either the Solve YouTube channel, or you can get involved for the last webinar coming up on January 15th. And last but not least, as always, these webinars are free, provided as an informational service and support to our community. And it is supported by donors like you. Your support is absolutely critical to making these possible. This is the time of year. If you're not aware, we have a special $200,000 match opportunity. Gifts will be matched so you can double your impact. $1 becomes $2 thanks to this match opportunity. So if you have not yet considered your end of year donation, we would be so humbled and I'm so grateful if you would consider us. Please scan the QR code on your screen to donate, or you can always go to solveme.org/donate. With that, thank you again, Dr. Jason. Thank you all of you for joining us and giving us your time. You can always view this again on our YouTube channel. And until next year, happy holidays, safe travels to those of you who are doing so. And may you have more good days than bad, and your rest be swift and recovery be complete. Thank you all so much. Take a wonderful care of yourselves. Bye-bye.